Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Napoleon and today I'm back with another Enlisted video, and today we're going to be doing a guide on the Grant, an American-British tank in Enlisted. This video will cover the history, the weapon, and in this case the vehicle, and how you should use said vehicle in Enlisted. So without further ado, this video has been made possible for friends at Discord, meaning that if you haven't liked, subscribed, or joined the Discord, I highly suggest that you do. But that said, let's get started with the Grant, the land battleship. In terms of its history, after development of the M2 medium tank at the Battle of France showed such a tank was not going to be capable against the German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. With the Western African allies now embroiled in the North African campaign against the Germans and the Italians, the allies needed a very good tank capable of against German Panzer tanks, and they needed it quickly. The M3 Lee tank started in the bases of the M2 medium tanks using the chassis and the VVSS suspension system. It had to mount a 75mm cannon, and it was discovered that the United States does not have a turret design that can mount a 75mm gun, so development on the turret proceeded, and the 75mm on the M3 was used to be a suspension mounted, and this vehicle was tested on the M2 medium tank as a T5E2, which was adopted as the M3 design. The M3 design featured a medium tank with two guns, the 75 on the whole mount, and the 37 on the coaxial machine gun on the turret. The turret cupola also has its own machine guns, and there were also two fixed bow machine guns. The two of these mount on similar tanks similar to the Soviet T-35 tanks. The M3 75mm gun, however, persists at a huge advantage over contemporary anti-tank guns, as the 75 could fire high explosive rounds for infantry and yet anti-tank guns. Yet it could fire a shell with high velocity for anti-tank purposes, once again, very good. The M3 faults were at the high profile and the substantial mount on its main armament, and the M3 had its 10 feet in tall and a feet taller than the M2 medium tanks. The 75mm on the substantial mount meant that the main armament on the tank had limited traverse compared to the rotationary turret found on the tank to reveal much of the body, and in order to aim the gun at the enemy, meaning that the tank has to turn. The M3 also had to be constructed out of rivets, which increased spangling and has a smooth track with reduced ground transaction. Despite these disadvantages, the British happily accepted them as they were low on tanks, and German Colonel Hans von Luck said that he even considered them superior to the Panzer IVs. The M3 first saw service from the British in the North African campaign beginning in May 1942. Those that were made were the British defined as Grants, whereas the additionally quality there were Lend-Lease to British later on, with American turrets, with the standard American turrets were called the Lee. The Grant turret on the Grant was considered superior in terms of frontal protection and was replaced by American smoke chargers with British smoke mortars, but did not have a cupola or a cupola of the MG on the Lee. The Grant also moved the radio into the turret, removing the need for a separate radio operator position in the hull, and the Americans will do that with their M3 as well. Their baptism of fire was at the Gonzalo battles, in which 167 Grants persisted with the 1st and 7th Armored Divisions. Regiments with the Grants were initially organized 2-to-1, 2 Grants to 1 Stuart, or 2-to-1, 2 Crusaders to 1 Stuart bases. But by the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Sherman was also added into that mix. Still, over 170 Grants or Lees were in the line of battle. These three tanks were the Lee troop. In May 1943, all British Grants and Lees were replaced with the newer and mostly the Shermans. Production of the Lee has begun in August 1941. A majority of these tanks were completed in Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The British were streamed more than the original order of 1,550, in total of 6,000 M3 being built by the US starting up at the end of the production in December 1942, of which 2,800 units, over 16,000 Grants and 1,200 Lees were sent to the British, and 3,000 Grants and 1,300 Grants were sent to the Soviet Union, where they served until 1943 while being replaced. A mix of Grants and Lees were also used by the Australian and Indian troops in the Indian-Burma theater beginning in December 1943, serving there until the end of the war with Japan. The M3 Lee caused confusion in British service, as the same designation was given to the M3 light tank. This set off their tradition of naming American-made tanks after generals, where the M3 medium tanks would earn the name for Lee after the Confederate general, and the Grant named after the Union general, and the M3 Grant was the M3 light tank was also called the Stuart. Americans did not see these names. The Americans did not use these names themselves, only staying to their names after the war. But that said, let's move on to the combat usage. In terms of the combat usage of such tank was experienced with complicated but favorable in North Africa. The Lees and Grants in British and American service surprised the German forces since they could withstand the 50mm and sometimes 75mm howitzer attachment on the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. The M3 Lee provided reliable and adequate in-armor protection. However, the Soviet experience was less favorable, as their T-34 tanks were much better in combat performance. The Soviets actually called them the Grey for 6 men, and the Lee tanks were actually regarded to secondary duties or repurposed as armored personnel carriers. In the Pacific, the M3 Lees were sent to the Australians and Indian troops, which were provided vast superiority to the Japanese tanks in service, considering the fact that the Japanese tanks can be mostly penetrated with either an anti-tank gun or in some cases a machine gun. The US used the M3 Lee at the Pacific Theater was during the Battle of Malkin Island. The M3 Lee served fine as a stopgap situation for American tank development. They performed very well on the combat field and provided very reliable. However, once a 75mm turret was finally designed, the M3 Lee was redesigned to use it, and the resulting tank was the M4 Sherman, which it could go to replace the M3 tanks and allies, but since they were withdrawn from service. Even if it wasn't, the M3 was becoming obsolete due to the newer German tanks being deployed, such as the Panther, the Tiger, or implemented of the old chassis like the Panzer Aus G, which had Sideschützen, the Stuka 3 Aus F, and even other vehicles. Its obsolescence was a consequence of its own rather unique development and ergonomic designs, limiting to this medium tank's life service a mere 2 years in Allied hands. However, it lived until the end of World War II in the Far East, in which it remained superior to the Japanese tanks once again, since they can be penetrated with almost everything except for the small arms fire, and it was ideal as an infantry support in which it had been designed for. Approximately 1,700 were transferred as soon as they were placed in North Africa. It was also continued after modifications as tractor and recovery vehicles. The chassis and the running gear was adopted by Canadians to develop their own Ram medium tanks. But that said, this is the M1 Grant. Let's move on to the stats. In terms of the stats, the Grant has a crew of 6, a 75mm M2 cannon of 65 rounds, of which is split between HE and AP, 37mm M5 cannon of 128 rounds, and a few 7.62 machine guns, which is in the turret, by the way. The maximum speed is 36.68 km per hour, so it's quite slow. Engine power of 340 HP at 400 RPM, weight of 26.9 tons. Hull armor is 51 meters, side of 38, back of 38, and bottom of 13. Turret armor is at 76mm, 51 on the side, and 38 on the top, which is quite interesting. At that said, let's move on to the recap section. To recap, the Grant is one of the best tanks that you can get in Allies Tunisia. It's one of the best tanks considering it has 2 guns, of which one is a HE and one is a 37mm gun. Obviously, I consider the Sherman 2 to be way better than the Grant because of its speed and its cannons and its machine gun. But the 2 guns on the Grant is actually quite impressive. As a matter of fact, I'll tend to use this thing as a heavy tank destroyer, considering that the fact that the only real gun that you can be using that can really do actual damage against a tank is the 75mm gun, of which against tanks such as the M14 and the AB-41, you're going to penetrate that without a problem, and you're going to be invulnerable to their attacks. While other tanks like the Shimavente is probably going to one-shot you, unless you take out the gunner, which, if you know where the gunner is, good for you. Other tanks like the Panzer III are going to have a hard time penetrating you, like in real history, but you actually should be able to do a good job of penetrating them, especially at close ranges. On the other hand, the F4 is going to be relatively easy to penetrate once again by your tank, with the 75mm gun once again. Of course, both the tanks are going to be really deadly, especially if they fire first, so once again, find your targets, have map awareness, fire at the enemy tanks first before they fire at you, and that's how you survive in a Grant. Against infantry, this is a monster. The two guns with both loaded HE can do a lot of damage, and if you're in the commander's cupola, you can just mow down with your machine gun and two guns. This is the literal definition of a battleship on land, and considering that the fact that the Grant was meant to have a 75mm HE firing shell against infantry, it is really, really good. The 37mm gun isn't as good as the 75, but once again, who cares? You have a 75mm gun. The only downside is that the slow speed, in terms of tricky situations such as a plane trying to bomb the heck out of you, you're not going to survive. Other stuff like a person throwing an AT pack or an explosive pack, you're not going to survive, so good luck. This is the Grant after all. It's one of the slowest tanks. I would say it's better than the Crusader, but I wouldn't say it's better than the Sherman. But one of the best tanks per level, and one of the best tanks in Allies Tunisia. Interesting fact is that the Grant also has two guns, so really makes this tank really unique compared to the Lee, which is Lend-Lease in Allies Moscow as a premium squad. But that said, this is the Grant, a very good tank, a very good tank overall, a infantry killer. And you honestly will be spending more time trying to find ammunition for your HE shells for your 75mm gun than trying to kill people, which is actually a big issue for the Grant. But that said, this is the Grant for you. Very good tank, really like it. And that said, I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the Discord, and I'll see you in the next one. Now before you leave, I would like to thank you very much for watching this video. I would be honored if you could like and subscribe to the channel. Remember, more videos are coming out, so it is a good idea to click on that notification button. Anyways, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.